The observation dome hummed with a gentle vibration as Kelrix adjusted the photonic filters on his viewing panel. Outside, the endless void stretched in all directions, punctuated by distant stars that had witnessed civilizations rise and fall across millennia. He pressed his three-fingered hand against the cool surface, feeling the faint tremor of the station's life support systems coursing through the metal. "Another quiet shift," muttered Vesa from across the chamber. Her crystalline eyes reflected the soft blue glow of her console as she logged routine scanner readings. 14 cycles without a single anomaly. "I'm beginning to think the Council sends us here as punishment." Kelrix clicked his mandibles in amusement. "You volunteered for Frontier Watch duty, remember? You said it would be spiritually enlightening to contemplate the universe from the edge of known space." "That was before I realized the universe is mostly empty," Vesa replied, her voice carrying that melodic quality unique to her species. "The ancient text spoke of mysteries in the dark. All I've found is darkness." The Frontier Watch Station Epsilon 7 floated in a region of space the Galactic Communion had designated as strategically irrelevant. No trade routes passed through this sector. No habitable worlds waited to be colonized. No resources warranted extraction. It existed as a checkpoint, a formality, a place where young officers were sent to learn patience before receiving meaningful assignments. Kelrix had spent 2 standard years here, watching emptiness. He'd memorized every constellation visible from their position, learned to predict the timing of distant stellar flares, and counted the grains of doubt that accumulated in his mind about the stories his instructors had told him at the academy. "Do you believe in the old myths?" he asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Vesa's head tilted, a gesture of curiosity among her people. "Which myths?" "The Communion spans 47 species across 12,000 worlds. We have more myths than we have stars in some sectors." "The human myth," Kelrix clarified. "The story about the species that supposedly existed before the First Communion. The ones the ancient texts mention in fragments." Vesa's expression shifted to something between amusement and pity. "You've been reading the apocryphal archives again, haven't you?" "Kelrix, those texts are considered historical fiction. Entertaining, perhaps, but not factual." "But the references appear across multiple species records," Kelrix insisted, pulling up a data file on his secondary screen. "The Volthene chronicles mention the ghost species who walked on 2 legs. The Crystalline Codex speaks of builders who came before and vanished like morning vapor. Even the Zephyrite oral traditions reference the ancestors who seeded consciousness but departed before the first ship sailed." "Coincidence and cultural convergence," Vesa said, though her tone suggested she'd considered this before. "Every civilization wants to believe in something greater that came before them. It's psychologically comforting to think we're part of a legacy rather than cosmic accidents." Kelrix nodded slowly, but his mind wandered to the texts he'd studied in secret. The humans were described in fragments and whispers, never in complete narratives. They were said to be builders and dreamers, explorers who had touched 1,000 worlds before disappearing without explanation. Some texts claimed they had transcended physical existence. Others suggested they'd destroyed themselves in ancient wars. A few hinted they had simply sailed beyond the galactic rim, seeking something the younger species couldn't yet understand. "If they existed," Kelrix said, "where did they go?" Before Vesa could answer, her console erupted in a cascade of alerts. Warning lights flooded the observation dome in crimson urgency. The gentle hum of the station transformed into a sharp whine as every sensor simultaneously activated. "What's happening?" Kelrix rushed to his station, his fingers dancing across the interface. "Multiple contacts." Vesa's voice had lost its casual tone. "Massive spatial distortions at bearing 327, range, impossible. The system says they're appearing at the edge of sensor range, but the mass readings suggest." The main viewing screen flickered to life, automatically focusing on the disturbance. Space itself seemed to tear open in 7,000 precisely coordinated points. Kelrix felt his respiratory system seize as he watched reality fold like paper, allowing something impossibly large to push through. Ships emerged from the tears in space. Not small craft or even standard cruisers. These were structures that defied everything the Communion knew about practical engineering. Each vessel stretched kilometers in length, their hulls dark as void between stars, their surfaces angular and purposeful. Running lights traced geometric patterns across their exteriors, patterns that suggested mathematics beyond standard navigation requirements. Dreadnoughts, Vesa whispered. 7,000 dreadnoughts. Kelrix's hands trembled as he tried to establish communication protocols. This is Frontier Watch Station Epsilon, 7 to unidentified fleet. You have entered Galactic Communion space without clearance. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. Silence answered him. The fleet maintained perfect formation, each ship positioned with mathematical precision relative to its neighbors. They moved with purpose, their trajectory calculated, their bearing unwavering. Try all frequencies, Kelrix ordered, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. Emergency channels, diplomatic channels, everything. I'm transmitting on every known wavelength, Vesa replied, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite the fear Kelrix could see in her crystalline eyes. They're not responding. Or they're choosing not to. Kelrix studied the sensor data, his training fighting against his instinct to panic. The energy signatures emanating from the fleet were unlike anything in the Communion database. The power output suggested technology centuries beyond current capabilities. The hull compositions indicated materials that shouldn't exist according to known physics. The propulsion systems left residual traces that made his scientific understanding question itself. Could this be a simulation, he asked, knowing the question was desperate. Some kind of sensor malfunction or academy test? Vesa shook her head slowly. The quantum verification algorithms confirm these are physical objects. Real mass, real energy signatures. Whatever they are, they exist. The lead vessel broke formation, accelerating toward the station with casual ease. As it approached, Kelrix felt a primal fear that transcended his intellectual understanding. This wasn't merely a large ship. It was a declaration, a statement of capability, a reminder of how small and fragile his station truly was. They're hailing us, Vesa announced suddenly. Audio only, single frequency. Kelrix authorized the connection with a trembling finger. The speakers crackled to life, and a voice emerged, clear, confident, speaking in perfectly accented common trade language. Frontier Watch Station Epsilon, 7, this is the UTNS Indomitable Will, flagship of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We apologize for our unannounced arrival. We have been away for a very long time. We are returning home. The words hung in the observation dome like physical objects. Kelrix tried to process them, tried to fit them into any framework that made sense. Terran. The word existed in the apocryphal archives. Terra, the mythical homeworld of the humans, the species that supposedly existed only in legends. This is Station Commander Kelrix, he managed to say, forcing professionalism into his voice. Your fleet composition and technology are not registered in Communion databases. We have no records of any species called Terran. Please provide verification of your identity and explain your presence in this sector. A pause followed, brief but weighted with significance. When the voice returned, it carried a tone Kelrix couldn't quite identify, something between amusement and sadness. We understand your confusion, Commander. Our last contact with this region occurred approximately 12,000 standard years ago. At that time, your Communion did not exist. Most of your member species were pre-industrial or pre-spaceflight. We departed to explore regions beyond the galactic rim. We are now returning to re-establish contact and resume our place in galactic affairs. 12,000 years. The number echoed in Kelrix's mind. The first Communion, the event that marked the beginning of modern galactic civilization, had occurred 11,800 years ago. The histories before that time were fragmented, incomplete, based more on archaeological evidence than reliable records. You're claiming to be human, Kelrix said, the word feeling strange on his vocal cords. The humans from the ancient texts. We claim nothing except truth, Commander. We are humanity. We left when we needed to explore, to grow, to understand what lay beyond the boundaries of known space. We found much. We learned much. And now we return, hoping to find that the younger species we left behind have flourished in our absence. Vesa was frantically sending emergency transmissions to Communion Central Command, her movements precise despite the situation's surreal nature. Kelrix watched the sensor displays, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of what hovered before him. 7,000 dreadnoughts. Each one capable of annihilating planets based on the power readings alone. Each one crewed by a species the Communion had relegated to mythology. Permission to approach your station, Commander, the voice from the Indomitable will requested. We would like to begin formal diplomatic contact. We understand you may need time to process this situation. We are patient. We have learned patience across 12,000 years of exploration. Kelrix looked at Vesa, who had paused her transmission efforts to meet his gaze. In her crystalline eyes, he saw his own confusion and wonder reflected. Every protocol they'd studied, every emergency procedure they'd memorized, had been designed for known situations. First contact with a mythical species commanding impossible technology was not covered in any manual. Stand by, UTNS Indomitable will, Kelrix said, buying time he desperately needed. I must consult with Communion Command before authorizing approach. This situation is unprecedented. Understood, Commander. We will maintain position and await your response. But may we suggest that you also consult your historical archives? Look beyond the official records. Examine the apocryphal texts, the fragments your scholars dismissed as fiction. You will find that we left signs, breadcrumbs of truth scattered across species and worlds. We hoped that one day, the younger species would piece together the puzzle and remember us. It appears that day has arrived. The communication ended, leaving Kelrix and Vesa alone with the impossible. On the main viewing screen, the Terran fleet waited with the patience of a species that had crossed the void between galaxies and returned. Their ships were dark and silent, yet somehow alive with purpose. Kelrix pulled up the apocryphal archives on his personal terminal, fingers moving with new urgency. He'd read these texts dozens of times, always treating them as historical curiosities. Now, he searched them with fresh eyes, looking for patterns he'd missed. The Volthene chronicles described encounters with tall beings who walked upright on two legs, who spoke in languages of art and mathematics, who built structures that touched the sky and ships that touched the stars. The crystalline codex mentioned teachers who shared knowledge freely but asked nothing in return, who guided without commanding, who disappeared when their students were ready to walk alone. The Zephyrite oral tradition spoke of the ancestors with skin of varied hues, who laughed easily and cried freely, who loved their children and mourned their dead with equal passion. Details that Kelrix had dismissed as poetic embellishment now read as eyewitness accounts. The texts weren't describing gods or supernatural beings. They were describing people. A species not fundamentally different from any other, except in their choices and actions. Communion Command is responding, Vesa announced, her voice pulling Kelrix from his reading. They don't believe me. They think our sensors are malfunctioning or we're experiencing some kind of psychological episode. Kelrix almost laughed. He understood their skepticism. If another station had reported 7,000 mythical warships appearing from nowhere, he would have questioned their sanity too. Tell them to aim long-range telescopes at our coordinates, Kelrix instructed. Tell them to verify with independent sensor platforms. And tell them to mobilize the first response fleet, just in case. Just in case of what, he didn't specify. If these ships were hostile, no fleet the Communion could assemble would make a difference. The technological advantage was overwhelming. But protocols existed for a reason, and following them gave him something concrete to focus on while his worldview reconstructed itself. The Indomitable will remained motionless, along with its 6,999 companions. They weren't advancing or threatening. They simply existed, patient as mountains, waiting for the younger species to catch up to reality. Kelrix thought about the ancient text's descriptions of humanity's departure. Most sources agreed the humans had left voluntarily, not fleeing but seeking. They'd gone to explore what lay beyond the galactic rim, to answer questions that pulled at their curious minds. Some texts suggested they'd left detailed instructions for the younger species, guidance on how to build a peaceful galactic civilization. The First Communion. The event that had united 47 species in cooperative existence. The principles of mutual respect, shared knowledge, and collective growth that formed the foundation of modern civilization. Had those principles been humanity's final gift before departure? Commander, Vesa said softly, what if they're hostile? What if they're returning to reclaim territory or establish dominance? Kelrix considered the question. He looked at the fleet formation on his display, noting how the ships were arranged in a defensive posture rather than an aggressive one. He thought about the voice from the indomitable will, how it had been courteous and patient, asking permission rather than demanding compliance. If they wanted to establish dominance, Kelrix said slowly, they wouldn't have asked permission to approach. They would have simply arrived wherever they pleased. 7,000 dreadnoughts don't need to be polite unless they choose to be. The council chamber on Communion Prime had never witnessed such chaos. Representatives from all 47 member species filled the circular hall, their voices creating a cacophony that the translation system struggled to process. Holographic displays floated above the central platform, each showing a different frontier station's view of the Terran fleet. 7,000 dreadnoughts had become 70,000 as more ships emerged from the dark spaces between stars, converging on Communion space from multiple vectors. High Chancellor Morvex stood at the center platform, her 4 arms raised in a gesture of unity that went unheeded. The silvered scales along her neck flushed with stress color as she attempted to restore order to a government that had never faced a crisis of this magnitude. Honored representatives, she called out, her voice amplified through the chamber's acoustic systems. We must approach this situation with wisdom, not panic. We must remember the principles upon which the Communion was founded. Principles won't matter if those ships open fire, shouted Representative Kilner, his insectoid frame trembling with agitation. We're discussing myths while an armada surrounds our space. We should mobilize every defense fleet and prepare for invasion. Or we could acknowledge that no invasion force asks permission before attacking, countered Representative Sila, her melodic voice cutting through the noise with crystalline clarity. These Terrans, if that's truly what they are, have made no hostile moves. They've waited patiently at every contact point for our response. That suggests diplomacy, not warfare. Morvex seized the momentary attention. The Emergency Scientific Council has been analyzing the data from all contact points. Dr. Theshan, please present your findings. A holographic figure materialized beside the Chancellor, an elderly Volthene scholar whose reputation for archaeological expertise was unmatched. His 3 eyes scanned the assembly before he spoke, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to presenting uncomfortable truths. Honored representatives, I have spent the past 6 cycles examining every reference to humans in our historical archives. What we dismissed as mythology appears to be fragmented historical record. The consistency of descriptions across cultures separated by thousands of light years and thousands of years of development suggests a shared experience with an actual species, not parallel myth-making. He gestured, and the holographic displays shifted to show ancient texts and artifacts. The Volthene Chronicles, the Crystalline Codex, the Zephyrite oral traditions, and 37 other sources all describe a species matching the physical characteristics we're now observing through long-range scans of the Terran ships. 2 legs, 2 arms, bilateral symmetry, diverse pigmentation. But more significantly, they describe behavioral patterns that align with what we're currently witnessing. What patterns? Morvex asked, encouraging him to continue. Patience. Respect for other species' autonomy. Willingness to share knowledge without demanding submission. The texts consistently portray humans as teachers and guides rather than conquerors. They arrived at worlds where species were developing, shared technological and philosophical insights, and then departed once those species achieved spaceflight capability. Dr. Theshan pulled up a star map. I've plotted every world mentioned in the ancient texts as having contact with humans. The pattern is remarkable. These worlds all achieved spaceflight within 1,000 years after human contact, and all became founding members of the First Communion. The timing is not coincidental. The chamber fell silent as the implication settled over the assembly. Representative Vorth, whose species had been among the First Communion's founders, spoke slowly. Are you suggesting that humans engineered the creation of the Communion? Not engineered, Dr. Theshan corrected. Guided. Prepared. The texts indicate humans didn't force anything upon younger species. They offered knowledge and allowed each species to develop according to their own nature. But they created conditions favorable for cooperation rather than conflict. They planted seeds that grew into the Communion after their departure. Why would they leave if they created this? Asked Representative Kilner, his agitation transforming into confusion. The texts offer various explanations, Dr. Theshan said. But the most consistent theme is curiosity. Humans appear to have been driven by an intense need to explore, to discover, to understand. They explored this galaxy thoroughly, and when they had learned what they could hear, they looked beyond. The galactic rim called to them, and they answered. Morvex studied the star map, her mind racing through possibilities. And now they've returned. The question we must answer is, what do they want? Before anyone could respond, an aide rushed into the chamber, his movements betraying urgency that violated all protocols. Chancellor, we're receiving a broad-spectrum transmission from the Terran fleet. They're broadcasting on every known frequency. They're asking to address the Council directly. The chamber erupted again in debate. Some representatives demanded the transmission be blocked. Others insisted it be heard. Morvex made the decision that would define her legacy. Play the transmission. The holographic displays shifted, and a figure appeared. Human. Female, by the physical characteristics Dr. Theshan's research suggested. She wore a uniform of dark blue material with insignia that meant nothing to Communion observers but suggested rank and authority. Her skin was a deep brown, her hair gathered back in a practical style, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who had seen much. Honored members of the Galactic Communion, she began, speaking in perfect common trade language. I am Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Terran Naval Service. On behalf of humanity, I greet you across the gulf of 12,000 years. We are aware that our return has caused confusion and concern. We apologize for the disruption to your peace. Allow me to explain our purpose. She paused, as if gathering thoughts too large for simple words. When my ancestors departed this region of space, they left behind 47 species on the cusp of achieving interstellar capability. They left with hope that these species would grow, would learn to cooperate, would build something better than humanity had built alone. We see now that this hope was fulfilled beyond our greatest expectations. The Galactic Communion stands as a testament to the potential of diverse species working in unity. Admiral Chen's expression softened. We did not return to reclaim territory or assert dominance. We are not conquerors returning to rule. We are explorers returning home, hoping to share what we've learned and to learn from what you've built. The galaxy beyond the rim taught us much, but it also taught us the value of community, of connection, of belonging to something larger than ourselves. We wish to rejoin the galactic community, if you will have us. Representative Kilner stood abruptly. Your fleet numbers in the tens of thousands. Your technology exceeds ours by centuries. You ask to rejoin a community, but you arrive with overwhelming force. How can we trust your peaceful intentions? Admiral Chen nodded, as if she'd expected the question. Trust must be earned, not demanded. We brought our fleet because 12,000 years is a long time. We didn't know what we would find upon returning. We prepared for every possibility, including the possibility that the galaxy had fallen into chaos or that hostile forces had emerged. Our fleet is our home, every ship carries families, communities, generations born during our journey. These are not warships alone. They are arcs, carrying the sum of human civilization across the void. She made a gesture, and the display split to show interior views of the Terran vessels. Parks and gardens filled vast chambers. Schools where young humans learned. Laboratories where scientists worked. Communities living complete lives within the hulls. We are a people in search of a home, Admiral Chen continued. We left our birth system millennia ago. The worlds we departed from have long since changed beyond recognition. The communion now occupies space where our ancestors once built their first colonies. We do not demand their return. We ask only for the opportunity to prove ourselves worthy of membership in what you have built. We ask for the chance to contribute to the communion rather than conquer it. Morvex stood, drawing every eye in the chamber. Admiral Chen, you speak of trust and contribution. What would humanity offer the communion? And what would you ask in return? We offer knowledge gained from 12,000 years of exploration, Admiral Chen replied. Technologies developed in environments you cannot imagine. Scientific insights from studying phenomena beyond the galactic rim. Medical advances, agricultural techniques, manufacturing processes, all things we would share freely, as our ancestors did before us. We offer our strength, not as overlords but as partners, to help defend against threats the communion may face. And in return? Morvex pressed. Planets. Uninhabited worlds where we can rebuild our civilization within the communion structure. Recognition as a member species with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The opportunity to have our children grow up as part of a galactic community rather than as eternal wanderers. We ask for what every species needs, a home and a place to belong. The chamber fell into contemplative silence. Representatives exchanged glances, consulted with advisors, weighed impossible choices. Dr. Theshan studied his datapad, his three eyes moving rapidly across ancient texts. Chancellor, he said suddenly, I've found something significant. Multiple texts mention a human promise. Before they departed, they told the younger species that they would return, when the children were ready, when the lessons had taken root, when the garden had grown. The texts suggest they planned this return. They believed the younger species would need time to develop without their presence, but they always intended to come back. Representative Sila spoke, her voice thoughtful. Then this isn't an invasion or a conquest. It's a reunion. They're returning to a home they prepared for their absence. But we've built this civilization without them, Kilner protested. The communion succeeded because we learned to cooperate among ourselves. We don't need ancient benefactors returning to claim credit for our achievements. Admiral Chen's image seemed to focus directly on Kilner, though the broadcast reached the entire chamber. You are absolutely correct, Representative. The communion's success belongs to you and your ancestors, not to humanity. We claim no credit for what you've built. We merely suggest that we played a small part in creating favorable conditions for your success. But the true work, the hard work of cooperation and compromise and growth, that was yours alone. We would be honored to learn from your example. Morvex raised a hand for silence. This council requires time to deliberate. Admiral Chen, we acknowledge your peaceful intentions and your request for membership in the communion. We ask that your fleet maintain position while we consider the implications of your return and formulate an appropriate response. Can you agree to these terms? Of course, Chancellor. We've waited 12,000 years. We can wait a few more days. But may I suggest one thing? Send observers to our ships. Let your scientists, your diplomats, your military advisors see for themselves what we are. Transparency is the foundation of trust. Morvex nodded slowly. That is acceptable. We will dispatch a delegation immediately. The transmission ended, leaving the council chamber buzzing with conversation. Morvex felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Every decision she made in the coming days would echo across centuries. The return of a mythical species, the integration of overwhelming technological advantage, the preservation of communion independence while acknowledging ancient debts, all of it balanced on a knife's edge. Dr. Theshan, she said quietly, assemble a team of historians and xenoanthropologists. I want every scrap of information about human culture and behavior analyzed. If we're going to negotiate with them, we need to understand them. Already underway, Chancellor. Representative Sila, I'm placing you in charge of the diplomatic delegation. Choose your team carefully. We need observers who can see clearly without prejudice. Sila bowed her head in acceptance. I'll depart within the hour. And Representative Kilner, Morvex added, turning to the skeptical insectoid, I need you to coordinate with our defense forces. Not to prepare for war, but to ensure we're monitoring the situation from every angle. Trust is good, but verification is essential. Kilner's mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. Despite his concerns, he was too professional to ignore his duty. As the council dispersed to their tasks, Morvex stood alone on the central platform, staring at the star maps showing Terran fleet positions. 70,000 ships, carrying millions of humans, waiting patiently for permission to return home. It was the largest migration in galactic history, and she held the power to welcome or reject them. She thought about the principles the communion was founded upon. Cooperation. Mutual respect. The belief that diversity strengthened rather than weakened civilization. If those principles were truly worth preserving, then they had to be extended even to species that challenged comfortable assumptions. But she also thought about the practical realities. Technology gaps created power imbalances. Power imbalances created temptation. Even the most peaceful species could be corrupted by overwhelming advantage. The communion had survived by maintaining relative parity among member species. How would it survive the addition of a species whose technology made them practically unstoppable if they chose conflict? Chancellor. An aide approached cautiously. The observation teams are ready to depart for the Terran fleet. But there's something you should see first. Morvex followed the aide to a private viewing room where a single display showed data from the frontier stations. What am I looking at? Energy readings from the Terran ships, Chancellor. Our analysts have been studying them. The power output from each dreadnought is enormous, as we knew. But look at this pattern. The aide highlighted specific energy fluctuations. These readings suggest the ships are operating at approximately 15% of capacity. They're deliberately limiting their power output to appear less threatening. But the potential. Chancellor, if they activated full power, each ship could generate enough energy to sustain a small planetary colony. The fleet collectively could power half the communion's worlds. Morvex studied the data, her mind racing. They're showing restraint. Demonstrating that they're not operating at combat readiness. Exactly. It's a signal, Chancellor. They're saying, look how careful we're being not to appear aggressive. They want us to know they're holding back. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The Terrans weren't just technologically superior. They were sophisticated enough to understand the psychology of first contact. They knew that overwhelming displays of power would trigger fear and defensive responses. So they were carefully calibrating their presence to appear strong enough to be respected but restrained enough not to terrify. Send this analysis to Representative Sila before she departs, Morvex ordered. And make sure the council sees it. This changes the calculation significantly. As the aide hurried away, Morvex remained in the viewing room, watching the distant ships on her display. Somewhere aboard those vessels, millions of humans waited to learn if they would be welcomed or rejected. Families who had lived their entire lives traveling through the void. Children who had never seen a planet. Elders who remembered the old worlds only through inherited memories. They were refugees, she realized. Not conquerors, not invaders, but refugees seeking to return home after an exile that had lasted 200 generations. The communion had always prided itself on welcoming those in need. How could they turn away an entire species simply because they were too powerful? But how could they welcome a species whose power could overturn everything the communion had built? The questions spiraled endlessly, offering no easy answers. Morvex knew that whatever decision the Council reached would reshape galactic civilization. They stood at a turning point in history, a moment when the past reached forward to touch the present, when myths became reality, when impossible choices had to be made despite incomplete information. She thought about the human promise Dr. Theshan had mentioned. When the children were ready. Were they ready? Was the communion mature enough to face the return of its mythical ancestors? Had they grown sufficiently to meet their creators as equals rather than children? Only time would answer those questions. And time, Morvex knew, was running out. The Terrans waited patiently now, but patience had limits. Eventually, they would need an answer. Yes or no. Welcome or rejection. Integration or separation. The fate of two civilizations hung in the balance, waiting for wisdom that Morvex feared no one possessed.